Recently, the popular YouTuber Metatron released a controversial video attacking another creator named Quelemica. The entire community of scholars who argue ancient Egypt was fundamentally an indigenous African civilization. Metatron's 35-minute diatribe aims to supposedly debunk any notions that ancient Egyptians were black Africans. He asserts they were actually olive-skinned Asiatics, and that Africans constituted a minority group within Egypt. In making these spurious claims, Metatron draws on biased interpretations of Herodotus and other ancient sources, while ignoring reams of credible evidence across archaeology, biology, art history, and genetics that contradict him. His arguments are dangerous not only because they are false, but because they support racist historical narratives that have been used for centuries to distort Africa's rightful legacy. Millions have viewed Metatron's video uncritically, and so in the name of truth and justice, we are gathered here today in this digital arena to systematically dismantle Metatron's house of lies. Point by point, we will reveal the deceptive tactics he employs to warp the reality about ancient Egypt and its indigenous Nilotic African peoples. This will not be an easy battle, but armed with facts, we shall prevail. So I welcome you all to join me in this epic campaign to defend the truth. Let the reckoning begin. In this video, I will set the record straight about ancient Egypt's origins, culture, and physical appearance by rigorously analyzing the evidence Metatron ignores. Over the next hour or so, I will systematically break down Metatron's claims and demonstrate how they contradict evidence from archaeology, skeletal biology, genetics, linguistics, material culture, art, and ancient Egyptian writings themselves. My goal here is not just to debunk, but to clarify the current scholarly consensus on ancient Egypt's indigenous African origins and multicultural character over its long history. Critiquing Metatron's methods. I focused mainly on countering the factual inaccuracies in Metatron's video, but it's also important to critique his overall approach, which appears intentionally misleading and slyly manipulative. Metatron spends over 10 minutes attacking the character and motives of Quelemica. He tries to preemptively paint this person as biased and dishonest in order to discredit their perspectives. However, Metatron reveals his own bias by admitting he has no stake in this issue and would suffer no consequences to his reputation if proven wrong. Yet for the African creator, their entire channel rests on this subject. This is clever rhetorical trickery on Metatron's part. In truth, he clearly has a personal investment in promoting the notion that ancient Egyptians were not black Africans. But he attempts to conceal this bias by projecting it onto his opponent. Metatron also pads his video with irrelevant tangents like complaining about video lengths and Wikipedia that have nothing to do with the core evidence.
Analyses are clearly developed in line with the research questions, with a constant overlap between theory and empirical data. As the basic structure of a linguistic research and interpretation, what we did as a team is that first we established the genre and discourse of the text in question, also trying to sample for other ethnographic information. Then we tried to locate similar text with similar topics. Beginning with the systematic analysis of lexical resources and lexicosyntactic features of text, we moved through a systemic function data analysis of genre and text metafunction.
He fixates on minor wording issues while ignoring vast amounts of contradictory data. After claiming to have worked extensively with PhD linguists and Egyptologists, Metatron makes demonstrably false statements about the Afro-Asiatic language family originating outside Africa. This casts doubt on his supposed expert collaborators. Ultimately, Metatron's arguments rely heavily on cherry-picked ancient quotes and his own conjectures about skin color differences. But he fails to engage with wide-ranging multidisciplinary evidence that invalidates his assertions. Rather than a genuine investigation, Metatron's video comes across as a calculated takedown attempt filled with misdirection and deception. It aims to reaffirm popular false notions about ancient Egypt that have been disproven by modern academics. While I've tried to substantive focus on countering his claims with facts, Metatron's overall methods reflect an unethical, unscholarly approach to history and anthropology. It should give viewers pause about trusting his perspectives on this complex subject matter. Metatron's interpretation of ancient sources. First, let's examine Metatron's use of ancient sources. A centerpiece of his argument rests on Herodotus, the 5th century Greek historian. Metatron cites Herodotus' statement that Egyptians had darker skin than Greeks as proof they were olive-skinned Asiatics. However, Metatron takes this quote out of context and projects his own meaning onto it. Herodotus explicitly states that the ancient Egyptians had dark skin, which he compared to Ethiopians. He never describes them as olive-skinned. In fact, the ancient Greeks consistently described Egyptians as having dark skin, including other writers Metatron ignores like Homer, Aristotle, Lucian, and more. The key point is that while Herodotus notes differences in shade between Greeks and Egyptians, he underscores the fact ancient Egyptians had dark skin pigmentation, not lighter olive tones. So, Metatron misrepresents Herodotus' account. Metatron commits a similar distortion with other classical writers. He quotes Roman-era sources like Strabo and Plutarch, describing Egyptians as lighter than interior Africans. But these authors wrote during periods of foreign Greek and Roman rule in Egypt, following centuries of immigration and intermixing. The people they observed were not native Egyptians, but an already multi-ethnic population under foreign domination. In contrast, the few classical sources who actually visited pharaonic Egypt like Herodotus insist the original inhabitants had dark skin. But Metatron selectively omits these key details. Archaeological evidence. Let's now turn to archaeological evidence, which offers a clearer picture of Egypt's early inhabitants. Excavations of pre-dynastic sites have uncovered remains of some of the earliest Egyptians, like the Badarians. Anthropological analysis shows these people possessed physical features typical of indigenous Nilotic Africans, including dark skin, tightly curled hair, and craniofacial features that align closest with populations in southern Sudan and Ethiopia. Genetic analysis further confirms strong biological continuities between ancient and modern Nilotic Africans inhabiting the Blue Nile region. In other words, archaeological remains clearly indicate the original inhabitants of the Nile Valley were indigenous Northeast Africans, not migrants from Southwest Asia as Metatron proposes. Mainstream scholars like Frank Yurko, Douglas Brewer, and Alice Stevenson agree the archaeological record points to ancient Egypt growing out of local African precursors. Metatron ignores all of this evidence. Origins of Egyptian civilization Metatron also implies that key aspects of Egyptian civilization, like writing, religion, and kingship, were introduced by hypothetical Asiatic settlers rather than emerging from indigenous African cultures. However, archaeology and linguistics suggest otherwise. Let's examine some examples. 1. Writing. The earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs appear fully formed in Upper Egypt and Nubia, with no precursor systems in the Near East. The language they encode also shows African structural features. Most scholars conclude writing arose independently in Africa. 2. Religion. Core tenets of ancient Egyptian religion, like belief in an afterlife god Osiris, mummification rituals, and reverence for sacred animals, have roots in pre-dynastic and Nilotic African societies, not the Near East. 3. Kingship. The rituals, regalia, and architecture of Egypt's monarchy demonstrate connections to Taseti, a proto-kingdom in Nubia predating dynastic Egypt. This indicates kingship began among indigenous Nilotic Africans before spreading north. Overall, the material culture of early ancient Egypt aligns closest with Nubia and the interior of Africa, pointing to origins among native African peoples rather than migrations from Southwest Asia, as Metatron wrongly claims. Ancient Egyptian art. Now we come to what is perhaps the most definitive proof against Metatron's theories, the art of ancient Egypt itself. Numerous tomb paintings, statues, coffins, and other artworks from all periods of pharaonic history depict Egyptians consistently with dark reddish-brown to jet-black skin tones, sharply contrasted with much lighter yellow and white-skinned portrayals of Asiatics and Libyans. Analysis of pigment hues and binding media confirms the colors reflect real human skin tones, not arbitrary artistic conventions. Mummies also show concordance between depicted and actual skin tones. Contrary to Metatron's assertions, pharaohs and other elites are very frequently shown with the darkest skin tones, affirming these colors represented higher status. In fact, the striking consistency in how ancient Egyptians depicted their own skin tones provides perhaps the most definitive proof that, regardless of variation, they perceive themselves as a dark-skinned people distinct from Asiatics. Metatron claims differences in skin tone reflect differences in sun exposure between upper and lower-class Egyptians. However, this explanation does not hold up under scrutiny. Nobles and royals are consistently depicted much darker than middle and lower-class Egyptians shown engaging in outdoor labor. In sum, the iconographic evidence overwhelmingly confirms that ancient Egyptians recognized themselves as a dark-skinned African people and depicted themselves as such for over 3,000 years. Their art directly contradicts Metatron's notions about Egyptians being lighter-skinned Asiatics. Mummy studies. Scientific testing of mummified remains provides final confirmation of the ancient Egyptians' indigenous African physical affinities and dark skin pigmentation that we see depicted in their art. Over the past decades, teams of international scholars have conducted extensive examinations of hundreds of Egyptian mummies from all social classes using autopsy, histology, and DNA analysis. Studies consistently show mummies had variations of reddish-brown to black skin, tightly curled hair, and craniofacial measurements clustering them with local Nilotic populations rather than Asiatics. Analysis of melanin levels and skin histology in multiple studies confirms pharaonic Egyptians fell within the peak range for indigenous Africans in dark skin pigmentation, as their art depicts. In fact, some focused studies of royal mummies show Egyptian elites possessed even higher melanin levels and more stereotypically negroid physiques than the average modern African American today. These scientific findings powerfully corroborate the evidence from Egyptian art that, contrary to Metatron's claims, pharaonic Egyptians were a predominantly dark-skinned indigenous African people. Linguistic relationship. Metatron makes misleading assertions about linguistics as well. He implies the Egyptian language as an Afro-Asiatic tongue, shows that ancient Egyptians came from Southwest Asia rather than Africa. In reality, the Afro-Asiatic family has deep indigenous origins in Africa, particularly among the ancestors of modern Ethiopians, Sudanese, and Chadians, populations who inhabited Northeast Africa for millennia before the Egyptians. Mainstream linguists agree that ancient Egyptian, along with its Nilotic branch, evolved within Africa from an Afro-Asiatic proto-language spoken around the Blue Nile region. Its closest linguistic relatives are other Nilotic languages like Nubian. Furthermore, beyond the core language, Ancient Egyptians spoke numerous African languages related to Nilo-Saharan and Niger-Congo families, reflecting their interactions and connections with other African peoples. So in fact, linguistics confirms deep roots and relationships between ancient Egypt and indigenous African cultures, contrary to Metatron's implications. Ancient Egyptian perspectives. Finally, when interpreting ancient Egypt, we should consider how the Egyptians viewed themselves, and their own writings tell a very clear story. Numerous texts praise the land of Punt, located in the Horn of Africa, as their sacred ancestral homeland. Egyptians also consistently portrayed themselves with identical dark brown skin colors as Nubians and Puntites in their art. Texts describing their gods are illustrated with pitch-black skin tones, affirming this was a positive ideal, not just for commoners. Irrefutable evidence shows that, from an emic perspective, ancient Egyptians perceived themselves as a distinctly dark-skinned African people closely aligned with Nubians and other Africans. In conclusion, an impartial review of all the evidence from archaeology, skeletal biology, genetics, linguistics, material culture, art, and self-descriptions overwhelmingly supports an indigenous African origin and identity for pharaonic civilization. Contrary to Metatron's claims, studies indicate ancient Egyptians exhibited a predominantly Nilotic African physical appearance, with dark brown to black skin tones, craniofacial features, and tightly curled hair. Scientific analysis confirms these traits represent a phenotype indigenous to Northeast Africa. While undoubtedly a diverse society over its 3,000-year history, the notion that pharaonic Egypt was founded by or majority populated by olive-skinned Asiatics finds no corroboration in current data across any scientific field. In this presentation, I've systematically outlined the evidence contradicting Metatron's theories and hope to provide factual clarity on this complex issue. As always, I welcome civil discussion and exchange in the comments section. Please like, share, and subscribe for more videos analyzing popular notions about history through a careful lens. I wish you all the best.